Tough questions, honest answers, real talk with the City of Oshawa.
Hi, everybody. It's Dan Carter, the mayor for the great city of Oshawa and the host of Real Talk. I'm excited to welcome you to this unique podcast that I hope will inspire authentic conversations and topics that are important to you and, of course, the time. My hope is that we'll address the issues that are impacting our province, our country, from affordability to challenges in the housing market, homelessness, healthcare, opiate crisis, and, of course, the political environment. I know our guests over the next year will bring different ideas and perspectives to these issues, and I'm looking forward to us having these conversations. So let's get started. I welcome Dr. Barb Perry. Dr. Perry is an expert in hate crimes, author of several books. She is a founding director, of course, on the Center of Hate and Extremism at Ontario Tech University. And by the way, Dr. Perry just recently was appointed Order of Canada that happened in December of 2024. Barb, that's pretty impressive. It's great to be able to join you once again, but congratulations on the Order of Canada. That's incredible.
Hi, Dan. Yeah, it really is. It took me by surprise and a very pleasant surprise. I found out just before Christmas, before everyone else did, actually in November. But it was a great holiday surprise. And it comes to pass that it was actually community members that nominated me, which is really, really important to me to know that the community is behind me and recognizes the work that I do.
The work you've done has been incredible, and it is wonderful to be able to spend time with you. You know, it's amazing. This podcast is at a really interesting time. Not only our country has gone through a lot, I think, in the last 5 years, but your work is really broad focus in regards to some of the challenges that we're facing today. As we know, President Trump is back in office once again, and many of us point to a time where President Trump was originally elected that felt that many of the issues that you're dealing with have risen to the top of the pile. And I just want to ask you a few things because I want to get some clarity. I've heard this term called the far right. What is the far right?
Yeah, it's a good question. And, some people don't use far right. Some use extreme right. Some use, right wing. I use right wing as sort of an umbrella term. And what we're really referring to here is a movement. There are groups associated with it, but I really see it as a loose movement, which is reactionary in nature, which tends to focus on moving the clock backwards in terms of the rights that have been extended to a whole array of communities. So they see all of progressive movements since the civil rights era as illegitimate, as, I think the core really is removing the privilege of those that have reigned supreme for so long, white Christian men, straight Christian men. So it really is a reaction against what we've seen over the past few decades. As Trump's MAGA, Make America Great Again, suggests there's this yearning back to a time when America was different, and in our context even, now we see Maple MAGA, when Canada was a different place, and that people knew their place in those hierarchies, and they went unchallenged. So it really is a very reactionary movement, typically, racist, misogynistic, nationalistic, anti-democratic. Increasingly, that is certainly something that we've seen since COVID, in the Canadian context in particular.
So, Barb, why is it happening right now? Has it just started over the last 5 years? And I've been lucky enough to know you for quite some time and been an observer of your work. Why is it happening right now? What do you think is contributing to it? Is it a disconnect? Is it people feel like their voice isn't being heard? Is it that we're changing so much that they can't identify of who we are or what we are? Why is it happening right now?
Yeah, a lot of those pieces are there, but we keep in mind that when we think about not just the U.S. context, but the Canadian context, we began to see a rise in all of these manifestations of hate, online hate crime, right-wing extremism, violent extremism in the Canadian context. Quite literally saw that begin to increase after 2016, Trump's first election. And so he resonated. I think some of those attitudes were there. If we look at public opinion polls, there were often something like, 30% of those surveyed would say, they opposed immigration, non-white immigration specifically. They opposed, they wouldn't want their family member to marry a Muslim, those sorts of things. So there was sort of that underlying current, but it wasn't necessarily acceptable to express those attitudes. So I think we have seen attitudes shift and change. More people have been convinced that that is the reality, but more people also think that it is legitimate to to express those sorts of sentiments. So I think that what we've seen is some of the grievances, some of the anxieties that we might have about, the changing world around us, perhaps, the economic crises that we faced over the past few years, and especially these last couple of years, in terms of, accelerated housing costs and rentals and grocery costs as well, that those have been, they're real, but they've also been constructed in a way that points fingers, that lays blame, that scapegoats communities. So, we saw, if we even think back to COVID, right, the stereotypes and the hostility directed towards Asian communities, toward Jewish communities that were held responsible for the virus. And then more recently, we've seen this characterization of immigrants and in particular international students being to blame for the lack of affordable housing. So I think that, again, those grievances, those fears that we have been exacerbated and have been crafted in ways that rather than directing anxiety and hatred upwards towards corporations and greedy developers, it's sideways or down.
Is there any similarities, or did this happen in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, especially through the First World War, Second World War, the huge immigration that came into Canada and other parts of the world? Did something similar like this happen, or is this different than what happened at that period of time?
No, you're absolutely right. There were parallels then. And I mean, if we look at, I'm thinking, sort of the 20s and the 30s, but also in the 70s and the 80s, in the US more than here. But there was always, this fear of the other, xenophobia, fear of the outsider coming in, changing our cultures, competing with us for jobs. When we think of the 20s and 30s, I mean, sometimes it was even, it was Italians, it was even Irish who were considered not white and a threat. So, those similar stereotypes. Oh, they're lazy, yet they're taking our jobs. We saw the same thing in the 70s and 80s during a period of economic crisis where there was a lot of hostility towards Asians, because that's when we saw really China begin to claim dominance economically. So, people in Detroit who had lost their jobs at automotive factories blamed the Chinese because they were building cheaper cars, blamed the Japanese because they were building cheaper cars. So it is cyclical, but it is also the case that those cycles involve the exploitation of those fears often by politicians.
What I've heard from some is this is different in some ways because, and I'm going to use this terminology, and please excuse me for using this terminology, they don't look like us. And so it's different than when the Italians came and when the French came and the Ukrainians came and the Greeks came at that period of time. And I've heard that before, that's what's fueling a lot of it. Am I utilizing the right words? Am I interpreting it correctly? Or is this, just one's opinion?
I think there's something to that to some extent. Thinking back to the anti-Chinese sentiment previously, that was also about in the 60s and 70s, we started to see the first waves of non-European immigration, large waves of non-European immigration, and that was frightening at that point in time. So I think it parallels that maybe more closely. But even in the 20s and 30s, we defined them as not looking like us, as I said, as not white. Italians were not white from the perspective of many North Americans, sort of Western Europeans in particular. But there is something distinct, I think, in terms of there's slightly more emphasis, slightly more visibility, if you will, in terms of the immigrants that we have here. And of course, it's been cumulative over time, too, because, now, what is it, probably 20, 25 years or so that we've seen so much South Asian or Middle Eastern immigration to this country. So it's beginning to see, we've hit that tipping point, perhaps, where people are fearful. I think the other piece of that is where we're seeing some of these, some of this activism bubbling up is in more rural areas, because traditionally folks have migrated to the cities. Well, the cities can't support them now. And communities are actually clamoring for immigrants to come, newcomers to come to their more rural communities outside the urban centers, because they need the employees, they need the workers. But that's instilled fear in a number of people as well. This is new to them, this diversity in their town.
Is there problematics as you go across Canada? Are there certain provinces that are really leading the way in regards to some of the challenges that they're facing?
Yeah, traditionally, where we've seen it has been Quebec, Ontario, and Alberta, to some extent, parts of British Columbia as well.
3 distinct areas areas, really, right? When you look at Western Canada, Alberta is very different. Ontario is different. And then Quebec is very distinct.
I think one of the things, too, is that we have seen a shift in all provinces, most provinces, I should say, in terms of a swing to the right, Alberta in particular, right, with their policies, especially around trans and queer issues there. But I mean, Quebec has long, and there it's largely a struggle around culture. And it has been, and religion, and what religion, because they're so closely intertwined, religion and culture. So there, it's much more European. It's much more French. It's an attempt to preserve that distinct society, to preserve Quebecois culture, not Canadian culture writ large. Now, there are some Canadian nationalists in Quebec, of course, but a lot of it does revolve around French culture and preserving that.
We've been observing what's going on in the United States, and what's really puzzled me in regards to seeing the MAGA movement across the United States since, I guess, 2015 or 14, and then through his first presidency and now into his second presidency, is the evangelical community and the Christian community that has really grasped onto this movement. And I, as a Christian, can't understand it. I struggle with it because much of the moral compass that I try to live my life by is not reflected in this movement or the leader. And I find to try and understand that I just can't.
I think there's two pieces to it. One is that those that we hear the loudest are, as you suggest, evangelical, fundamentalist Christians, who I think really do abide by those values, that there are, only two sexes, that a woman's place is in the home, very traditional, very patriarchal, ascribe to the notion of one chosen people, that being, white now Christians. So we've got that dynamic going on, and they are very loud. But the other piece is the exploitation of that then, and the use and abuse of scripture to justify racist policies or anti-woman or anti-feminist policies. So an insincere adoption of a misinterpretation, I think, of Christian values. You're absolutely right. When I think about the Archbishop who spoke up to Trump on the day after inauguration, that was a Christian speaking. He is never a Christian when he speaks.
And I think that's where I struggle. I struggle with, I know that the faith communities that I belong to, there are very, very much about principles and who we are and how we conduct ourselves and the words that we use and those kind of things. But showing, the worst of an individual and then embracing because this belief is there. I just struggle so much with it. But making fun of a reporter because they have a disability, calling people derogatory names, especially attacking women, those kind of things are offensive to me and offenses as a Christian. But I have on the other side, we have the Christian community that says, yeah, that's our guy. And I kind of sit there and go, I just can't figure that one out. And I think a lot of Canadians and a lot of people are struggling with that.
Well, I think it's especially hard for Canadians to understand that because we are a much more secular society. As much as the U.S. claims, separation of church and state, there is no such separation there. And so for us, I think that it is deeply puzzling and deeply concerning as well. I mean, as long as he says something like, I'm a Christian, his followers seem to believe him, regardless of all evidence to the contrary.
I want to talk to you about the freedom convoys or the trucker protests in Ottawa and trying to really understand what transpired through that period of time. And it was many different things, I believe, but I've never seen that type of hostility. I've never seen that type of aggression. I've never seen people that were so committed in regards to where they were standing and what they believed. And I don't think Canadians had ever observed that before. So what is it that we don't understand about that period of time?
It was a real turning point for us. I think we'd already been primed by the incivility of Trump for the 6 years before that. So, a lot of that hostility had already begun to emerge. We'd already, because of Trump's, think about it, followed the events of January 6th, where, that was sort of the epitome of these claims that, our key institutions are broken. Our key institutions have failed us. And so we saw there, I think with COVID coming together, distrust in the government, this freedom movement movement was about hands off, about government overreach in terms of the public health provisions, all of that. So there was distrust of the state. There was distrust of science and medicine in the anti-vaxxers. There was distrust of law enforcement because they were seen to be on the side of that tyrannical state. So there were just so many layers there. And you add to that then the economic anxiety that people were experiencing in terms of job loss or at least a hiatus from employment, as well as small businesses that were closing because they couldn't continue, restaurants that could no longer continue. So those grievances were wrapped up with all of these other pieces as well within the movement. And again, exploited by the leaders of that convoy movement specifically. I mean, those were people, many of them have gone to trial by now, who had a long history of association with the far right in the Canadian context, who had been part of the earlier United We Roll convoy a couple of years prior to that. So we had people like Jeremy Mackenzie, who was the leader of an accelerationist group, their aim is to accelerate what they see as an inevitable civil war and the collapse of the current order. So when you have those kinds of people at the helm, they are going to exploit, just as I mentioned earlier on, in different contexts, they're going to exploit those anxieties, and they're going to give us people to blame and give us processes to blame, and much of that fell at the feet of Trudeau and the federal government, in spite of the fact that it was the provinces were primarily responsible for public health provisions.
Did we learn anything from that period of time?
Apparently not, because many of those folks from the freedom movement are still quite active. And that's what this Maple MAGA movement is now, the pro-Trumpers. Many of them are leftovers from the freedom movement. Some of them morphed into the anti-trans activism that we saw so much of last year and the year before, where we were seeing attempts to hijack school boards so that they could impose these often, again, fundamentalist values into school curricula and remove references to sexuality and gender identity, to remove the rights of queer and trans youth.
Which really is a major issue that is starting to get even more wind under its sails here in Canada, but seems to be the center of a conversation that's happening in the United States as DEI or EDI in the United States. And we've witnessed it in a very short period of time under this president, but you're also seeing major corporations now back off of their commitment in regards to it. And how do you interpret that? Is that strictly about fear of repercussions from the president of the United States, or are these core beliefs that they truly believe that there's no place in their organization or their community for these initiatives?
Yeah, a little bit of both, because we had already been seeing a withdrawal from EDI initiatives for some time now, for a couple of years in some large corporations. And I think, it was a very similar reaction to the MAGA reaction. It's that we've gone too far, and that EDI leads to incompetency, and we're hiring the wrong people with, no evidence to support that. But nonetheless, I mean, think about, if you look at the Fortune 500 corporate heads, even smaller industries, corporate heads, aren't many people of color there, aren't many women there. So it's still white men calling the shots. And when they see around them, this anxiety or this threat that's posed to the privilege of them collectively, that's one reaction, is to push back against it. So again, I feel like Trump throws something at a wall to see what'll stick. And, it was clear to him, I think, that if he threw this at the wall, there would be all kinds of support for that. And there has been, but there's also been a lot of pushback against him. So, we're seeing, I think, two forces coming together here.
I want to ask you about what keeps you up at night. I heard you state in one of your presentations that I think they're called the 3%ers that you refer to, and that was something that you were really concerned about. But what's keeping you up at night now as an expert in this field?
Donald Trump and Pierre Poilievre. Well, Trump for obvious reasons, and especially these last 2 weeks. I mean, literally, it has kept me up at night. I'm just so stressed by what's happening. But I'm also fearful that we're seeing similar narratives creep into our own political narratives here. We've seen it at the provincial level, in Alberta in particular, to some extent Quebec, some of the other provinces that have implemented, anti-trans policies that have, not supported, Indigenous folks in their lands claims those sorts of things. But also, I think we're seeing it at the federal level as well. We certainly saw it with Bernier when he first created the People's Party of Canada. That's been overshadowed now, I think, by the Conservative Party, which has taken a turn to the right and is sort of doubling down on its anti-immigration sentiment, but also the anti-trans, as Polyev said last week. He doesn't know that there's anything other than two sexes, which will be problematic down the road. Now, granted, he also said, but that's none of our business as a government. It doesn't seem to have stopped folks from at the provincial level or even at the federal level in the past from intervening in people's lives and decisions and the way they live their life. So,
do you have faith in some of the leaders that are across the nation? I had the opportunity when Mr. Broadbent passed away to meet Premier in Manitoba, Canoe, and very impressive speaker, very impressive individual standing in a very interesting place and really having hard conversations with this country. I don't know if you've had the occasion to deal with the Premier on a one-to-one, but I walked away quite impressed in regards to his presence and also his positions.
Yeah, and I haven't unfortunately had the chance to work with him, but I work with a lot of educators in Manitoba, and they have incredible respect for him. So that speaks volumes to me, because these are the folks I work with are social studies teachers who are committed to enhancing the inclusion of their students, the belongingness of their students, regardless of their background. And the Premier is certainly a leader in that space, has been for years. I mean, he I think established a very powerful and strong reputation long before he even considered, I think, running for the leadership of the province. So yeah, I absolutely respect him. There aren't a lot. I think we're in an impoverished situation in terms of political leadership here. There's not much that gives me much hope. You mentioned Ed Broadbent. I remember when we presented him with I think it was very early on, maybe our second year, presented him with it couldn't have been. Was that when we had our first graduating class at Ontario Tech? We presented him with an honorary degree, and I was just gushing. I was embarrassing myself so much, because I think he's one of the greatest statesmen that this country has seen.
He's a very, and I had the opportunity, we named our waterfront park after the Ed Broadbent Waterfront Park, had the opportunity to be able to get to know him later in the stages of his life, of course, his passing, and his family was generous enough to allow me to come and be a part of his celebration of life in Ottawa. And I was really honored by that because of the significance of his contribution to our community here in Oshawa, and also the places where he stood in very difficult times, in challenging places, and took on challenging conversations. So that really goes to not only what you're doing today, but do we have the people to be able to have these hard conversations? Because, these are conversations that are going to make people uncomfortable, but I think they're in conversations that need to happen. And in my opinion, I think now is the moment. We need to have open conversations about interpretation, about some of these extremist groups, the damage that can be done. What are we trying to accomplish? So my question being is I guess, where do we start, Barb, and how do we start making sure these conversations, as uncomfortable as they may be, how do we start?
Yeah, at the federal level, and I think to some extent even at the provincial level, it's become challenging because there aren't conversations anymore. There are slag fests and screaming matches, and when you call the prime minister a wacko, then something's wrong with the way that we are operating, where that incivility is being modeled rather than civility in the top echelons of government. So, I don't think we looked that direction for guidance or for modeling. I think that a lot of it, again, it always comes back to education, of course, in enhancing children's ability and youth's abilities to have those conversations, to be informed. And that's one of the most important things, I think, is to be informed. I talk a lot about critical digital literacy because that's where we get our information. We get our information online. We get our misinformation and our disinformation online as well. Let's start to be a little more critical about what we see. If someone makes a claim that a politician said this or did that, on Joe Blow's website, that's not enough. You need to go to multiple legitimate sources. And I know people will reject legacy media, but they're still much more objective than the likes of Fox News or Rebel News or Joe Blow's website. I think that we need to retrain ourselves to be critical consumers of the information that's being presented to us. It's hard. Some people don't want to do that because they don't want to be convinced otherwise. But I think often starts in small circles with family and friends, but I think educators have a lot to do. The challenge is that it's not just kids, it's adults as well. How do you get to adults? And I think that's where I keep saying that's where the labor movement is so important, is to initiate those conversations, in carefully moderated ways, or I shouldn't say moderated, but sort of carefully framed ways in the workplace, not on the floor as people are working, but with dedicated sessions devoted to that. I've done a few of those myself for some workplaces. Is how do you at least initiate those difficult conversations, and how do you know when to just end it and walk away?
I'm going to kind of bring it all the way together here, and I just want to ask you. I grew up at a time my parents were born in 1915, so you can imagine the principles that I grew up in, very, very traditional kind of things. My mother said, "You never hate anyone." What is hate?
I mean, there are people who do hate. I mean, they're literally, that is the emotion that they feel. But for me, and I've written a couple of papers on exactly that question, right? What do we really mean when we talk about hate crime, or we talk about hate in this context? And as I say, for some, it is an emotional response, but you have to unpack that. Where does that come from? But for a lot of people, what we think of as hate and hateful narratives and hateful speech, it's about power and privilege. It's about imposing your power over others. It's about sometimes reasserting your power if you feel like you're losing that place of privilege and advantage. So for me, it's very much a political entity. It's not always, or it's not just an emotion. I think it's much more than that. I mean, even people who might have some, they're uncomfortable with a particular person because of who they are and their community. They're often then fed the narratives that translate that from discomfort and uncertainty to hatred. I know that this is something foreign to me and I don't really understand. That's why it seems odd to me, because those people, are responsible for crime. They're responsible for too many drugs in their communities. They're lazy. So they're sort of fed the kinds of fodder that can enhance, sort of exacerbate uncertainty and discomfort to something that they might feel or experience as hate.
What do you need us to do as a public in regards to us addressing the complexities of today's changing environment, changing society, changing political environment? I think one is having conversations like this are always helpful. I try and go into every conversation as a student, so I'm learning something that I didn't know before, and I've already learned a great deal today. What is it that we absolutely need to do, Barb?
Well, I think we need to start by caring. I think there's an awful lot of apathy because of many of the issues that we've been talking about here today, because people feel like they've been left behind, because they feel like they don't matter in the political process. So I think, first of all, we need to care, and we need to then inform ourselves and dig deeper, dig below the surface of the narratives that we're being fed. And that's something, again, we all have busy lives. We don't want to spend time having to, do the research, but going to the experts, like we have to find a way to renew trust in science, in the kinds of scholarship that myself and my colleagues do. And one of the ways that I do that, obviously, is being a public intellectual and having conversations with people across the community, across the globe, in fact. So we have a job to do, I think, in making ourselves relevant again. But again, we have to have a receptive audience. So I think caring and learning, and then standing up and challenging and calling out hatred and disrespect and exclusion when we see it.
I really respect the work you do. I respect where you stand, and I know what you're trying to accomplish, which is really to make sure that we're better informed. We're having these difficult conversations because you really believe your heart and soul that when we do have these conversations, some great things can happen. And I think that's really important. In my opinion, we are at a pivotal time in the history of our country right now. And we have a lot of challenging issues that face us. But I think that it's going to take all of us to be able to kind of embrace the challenge and to be able to have these conversations and really be comfortable with disagreeing and agreeing and trying to find a pathway forward. It can't be what it is today, which is you're 100% right and I am 100% wrong, because that doesn't help anybody. Still love what you do?
Well, yeah. I don't know if love is the word given the challenges, but it continues to be, let's say, stimulating and provocative. So yeah, I mean, I still get a lot of satisfaction from the work that I do. I don't. It doesn't make me happy that I have to continue to do this. I would like to have worked my way out of a job, but that's not been the case, sadly.
Till next time, it's always a pleasure. You stay well. All the best to your family. And thank you for not only your contributions to our community, but to the rest of the world. You're doing an amazing job. Congratulations on the Order of Canada. I think that's amazing. Barb, stay well. Keep up the great work. I hope everybody's enjoyed this conversation. If you want to hear more, subscribe to Real Talk Oshawa on Spotify or Apple. But we are going to keep the conversation going. I'm going to encourage you to do the same. A special thanks, of course, to our team here at the great city of Oshawa and our communications team, Dr. Barb Perry, Ontario Tech University, and of course you for tuning in. Till next time, have a great day and have a conversation.